The engine didn't explode. It didn't fail dramatically. It simply went quiet. And in that quiet, the gulf became enormous. Too wide for shouting, too deep for guessing. Daniel tapped the ignition once more, while Luis stared at the horizon that had already erased the shoreline. The radio answered with static. The fuel gauge showed half a tank, but the motor wouldn't turn. And the worst part was knowing the storm warning had mentioned rapid development, a phrase that sounded harmless on land, but out here meant they had already run out of time. February 17th, 1993. Gulf of Mexico, 30 miles south of Terrebonne Bay, Louisiana. The morning had opened under a flat gray ceiling with southeast winds near 15 knots and air in the low 50s, seas running 2 to 3 feet and steady. The kind of late winter day that makes fishermen cautious but not afraid, because February shrimp can pay a month's bills if the water cooperates. And Daniel had calculated fuel, distance, and tide with the quiet discipline of someone who survives on margins, while Luis worked beside him on the aging shrimp boat Maribel, coiling lines, checking knots, watching the barometer by the cabin door fall in a smooth, patient line that suggested something larger building far beyond sight. Yet not urgent enough to send them back early, not yet. By noon the swells had grown heavier, not sharply taller but longer and more deliberate, lifting the hull with slow force, the horizon beginning to tilt in a way that unsettled balance, the wind edging southwest and climbing past 20 knots, white caps forming with sharper crests, and Daniel decided on one final haul before turning toward shore. Because 30 miles is manageable with a working engine and careful throttle. Because diesel cost money and empty nets cost pride. And when they brought in the last trawl, the sky to the west darkened in layers, clouds stacking low and fast, the light thinning though it was still afternoon, the gulf changing from green to a hard metallic gray that made distance impossible to judge. Daniel stepped into the cabin, turned the ignition to raise the engine from idle, and heard only a hollow click. No grinding, no warning, just the absence of motion. He paused, adjusted the throttle slightly, tried again. The same thin mechanical refusal, answering him while the boat rolled broader against the swell. Luis waiting for anger that did not come. Daniel instead checking the fuel gauge, half a tank, then the voltage meter trembling below normal. The realization forming slowly that the battery might be failing while the alternator, silent without a running engine, could do nothing. The wind now gusting toward 25 knots and pushing the bow offline so the hull began turning sideways to the waves, each impact heavier than the last, not catastrophic but steady and escalating. Daniel reached for the VHF radio, adjusted the squelch, called toward the Coast Guard sector near New Orleans. Static filled the cabin. Then a broken fragment from another vessel reporting rough water near Grand Isle, before dissolving again into noise. The antenna rattling above them as Luis moved across the deck securing loose buckets and tying down gear, because even drifting, details mattered. A loose hatch becomes flooding, a sliding crate becomes injury, and with the engine silent, the boat no longer felt like a machine under control, but a small object subject to wind and current. The barometer dropping another notch, the first heavy gust striking hard enough to shutter the cabin windows. And in that long, uneasy roll between waves, both men understood without speaking that they were no longer calculating profit or fuel efficiency. They were calculating time. The first real wave struck them sideways at 2:40 p.m., not towering but heavy, the kind that doesn't crash so much as shove. And the Maribel answered with a long wooden groan that traveled from bow to stern, Daniel gripping the wheel though it no longer controlled anything, instinct refusing to accept drift, while Luis braced against the rail and watched the stern swing wider, the wind now steady above 25 knots with higher gusts rolling through in uneven pulses, the sea building toward 5 and 6 feet, steepening as the frontal boundary pushed down the coast faster than forecast. The sky lowering until horizon and cloud became the same color, and with the engine dead, the boat began to lie broadside between sets, each impact stealing balance, each second without propulsion narrowing their options. Daniel tried the ignition once more, and the starter clicked weaker this time, the voltage needle sagging further, confirming what he already knew. The battery would not survive many more attempts, and even if it did, the engine needed compression and heat that the failing system could no longer guarantee. He exhaled slowly and shifted from trying to restart toward trying to survive, ordering Luis to deploy the sea anchor, a canvas drogue kept for exactly this kind of loss of control. Because facing the bow into the swell was no longer about navigation but about staying upright. Luis crawled forward along the pitching deck, tying off with deliberate movements, every knot checked twice as spray swept across him in cold sheets. The water temperature barely above 50 degrees, cold enough to drain strength fast if either of them slipped. When the drogue caught the water, the change was immediate but imperfect. The bow began to point more reliably into the waves, reducing the violent roll yet increasing the pounding as each swell met them head-on, the hull rising and slamming down with a force that rattled dishes in the cabin and shook rust from bolts that had endured decades of seasons. Daniel killed all non-essential power to preserve what little charge remained, radio on low, cabin lights off, bilge pump monitored manually, because automatic systems could no longer be trusted, and the realization settled in that rescue, if it came, would depend on someone hearing a broken transmission or noticing their absence by nightfall. Luis climbed back into the cabin soaked and breathing hard, anger flashing briefly as he asked how far the nearest platform might be. Daniel calculated quickly. Oil structures dotted parts of the Gulf, but not close enough to see in this visibility, and drifting speed under wind and current might carry them west at nearly 2 knots, which meant every hour changed their search radius dramatically, the math tightening like a fist around both men, daylight thinning earlier than expected under the storm clouds, and with it the last illusion that this was temporary inconvenience, instead of an unfolding test of endurance. Another gust struck, harder than the last, rain beginning not in drops but in sheets, visibility collapsing to a few boat lengths, and Daniel reached for the radio again, voice steady but lower now, repeating coordinates from memory because the GPS flickered uncertainly with the unstable voltage, while outside the Gulf continued to rise, patient and methodical. And for the first time that day, neither man spoke about getting home, only about keeping the bow pointed forward through the next wave. By 4:10 p.m., the rain erased distance completely, the Gulf turning into a moving wall of gray where sky and water merged without seam, and the Maribel climbed each wave only to fall into the next trough with a force that shook the ribs of the hull. Daniel keeping both hands on the wheel not to steer but to steady himself, counting seconds between sets to anticipate impact, because rhythm meant control and control meant survival, while Luis monitored the bilge with a flashlight held between his teeth, checking for steady seepage instead of sudden flooding, knowing that slow water could be managed and fast water could not, the sea anchor holding but straining, its line humming under tension like a wire about to sing too loud. A heavier set rolled through just before 5, one wave lifting the bow high enough to expose more hull than either of them liked, the next striking square and sending a sheet of water across the deck that forced Luis flat against the planks, cold flooding into his sleeves, Daniel shouting without panic but with command, "Hold the line, check the cleat, make sure the drogue isn't twisting, because if that line snapped, the boat would turn broadside again and the pounding would become dangerous instead of survivable." And when Luis crawled forward to inspect it, he saw the chafing beginning where rope met metal, fibers thinning under strain, a small detail that now carried enormous weight. Inside the cabin, the GPS flickered twice and went dark, the battery finally conceding what the voltage gauge had warned, leaving them with compass, chart, and memory. Daniel calculating drift again. Wind southwest near 30 knots now, current pushing northwest, meaning each hour widened the distance between them and any predictable search path. He considered deploying a flare to mark their position but rejected it immediately. Daylight still present though dim, and flares were finite, saved for when visibility might briefly open or when an engine could be heard through the storm. Resource management no longer about profit, but about endurance. The temperature dropped as the front advanced, air slipping toward the upper 40s, wind cutting through wet clothes with steady persistence, Luis shivering despite movement, Daniel forcing both of them to drink small measured sips from the water jug, because dehydration creeps even in cold weather, discipline over instinct, fear held at arm's length by tasks that could not be postponed, tightening a knot, checking a hatch, repositioning weight inside the cabin to balance the bow against impact, every motion deliberate, no wasted energy. At 5:37 p.m., a distant low vibration cut through wind and rain for 3 uncertain seconds. Not thunder, not wave. Something mechanical carried briefly across water, both men freezing in place to listen. Daniel stepping outside into the spray and scanning the blank horizon, heart pounding not from fear, but from possibility. The sound fading as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only wind and the steady crash of seas against wood. And in that returning silence, they understood that hope itself could be dangerous if it distracted them from the next wave already rising ahead. By 6:20 p.m., daylight had thinned into a metallic dusk that made distance impossible to measure. The storm front fully overhead now, with sustained winds near 30 knots, and higher gusts pushing spray flat across the deck, the Maribel rising and dropping in a punishing rhythm that no longer allowed for standing upright without bracing. Daniel keeping count under his breath between impacts, while Luis wedged himself near the cabin doorway with a length of rope looped around his waist for security. The sea anchor still holding, but the chafed section of line wearing thinner each time the bow plunged and the load snapped tight again. A small fray that had become the center of their attention, because if it parted, the boat would yaw sideways and the next broadside strike could roll them far enough to flood the engine compartment completely. Rain intensified into cold sheets that blurred even the bow from the cabin window, and Daniel made the decision to rig a secondary safety line to back up the drogue, crawling forward with Luis despite the deck pitching beneath them, both men moving slowly and deliberately. No wasted motion, fingers numb but precise as they secured an additional line to a reinforced cleat, doubling their margin by inches and knots and friction. The rope biting into wet palms as another set rolled in, one wave cresting higher than the rest and slamming down hard enough to shutter the entire hull. A crack sounding somewhere aft that made them freeze for a half-second before realizing it was a loose panel tearing free. Not structural failure. Fear rising fast, then settling just as quickly because panic cost energy they could not spare. Back inside the cabin, Daniel checked the bilge again with a handheld light. Water present, but not rising quickly. Manageable for now. The manual pump requiring steady effort every 15 minutes. A new rhythm added to their survival routine. Pump, check lines, monitor wind, ration water, listen for engines. And through it all, the cold creeping deeper as wet clothing refused to dry. Air temperature dropping toward the mid-40s as the front advanced eastward across the Gulf. Luis's hands beginning to shake. Not from fear, but from sustained exposure. Daniel forcing him to sit for a moment while he pumped, insisting on rotation because endurance would matter more than strength. At 7:05 p.m., darkness settled abruptly under the storm cloud ceiling. Not a gradual sunset, but a sudden absence of depth. And with it came a new sound beneath the wind. A distant horn carried faintly across the water, low and intermittent. Daniel stiffening, turning off the cabin light entirely to avoid blinding his night vision, stepping outside into the spray and straining to locate direction. The horn sounding again. Closer this time, yet still unseen beyond sheets of rain. Luis gripping a flare gun but waiting for Daniel's signal, because flares were finite and mistimed hope could cost them later, and in that narrow margin between action and hesitation, both men felt the weight of a single decision pressing down harder than the storm itself. The horn sounded again at 7:11 p.m., deeper this time, no longer imagined. Carried unevenly by gusts that bent the rain sideways, Daniel standing at the edge of the cabin gripping the frame as the Maribel climbed another wave, straining to separate direction from echo, because sound in heavy weather twists and rebounds across water. Luis beside him, holding the flare gun but waiting. both of them knowing that one flare too early meant darkness later with nothing left to burn. The wind now holding near 35 knots as the front fully crossed their position, seas steep and confused, cross-chop forming where wind opposed current, each impact sharper and less predictable than before. Daniel counted between blasts, measuring distance by delay, 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds before the horn returned. Closer, then swallowed again by wind. He made the call without looking back. Fire when you see structure, not before. Conserve until certainty. Luis nodding though his hands trembled from cold and strain. The chafed drogue line groaning under another hard set. Fibers holding but visibly thinning in the brief flashes of lightning far to the west. Not overhead yet, but enough to outline the sea in violent white for a fraction of a second. And in one of those flashes, Daniel thought he saw a darker shape rising and falling beyond the curtain of rain. They waded through 2 more waves, the horn now unmistakable and bearing slightly north of their bow. Daniel shouting above the wind to shift the boat a few degrees using rudder drag against the drogue. Not propulsion, but alignment. Squeezing control from physics rather than machinery. Luis adjusting weight inside the cabin to help the bow respond. The movement subtle but enough to keep their heading steady into the swell. And then through the rain, a silhouette emerged. Tall and squared. A working vessel riding higher than them. Its navigation lights diffused but present. Proof that the sound was real and moving toward their drift path. Fire now, Daniel ordered. And Luis pulled the trigger, the flare streaking upward in a violent red arc that painted the rain and wave tops in brief crimson, illuminating the Maribel's worn deck and both men standing exposed to wind and spray. The flare hissing as it climbed before burning bright above them, and for 3 suspended seconds, the larger vessel's outline sharpened in response. A horn blast answering immediately, closer and directed, cutting through the storm with intent rather than distance. The flare died quickly, darkness rushing back harder than before, but the horn sounded again almost at once, no longer searching but signaling, and Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not relief yet, but alignment, because rescue in heavy seas was not instant salvation but another maneuver requiring precision. The Maribel still vulnerable, the drogue line still fraying, the wind still pressing at 35 knots, and as the larger vessel altered course toward them, the next challenge became clear, surviving the approach without losing control, before help could close the final, dangerous distance. By 7:18 p.m., the larger vessel was no longer just a silhouette, but a moving wall of steel and light, its deck lamps cutting through rain in pale cones that swept across the sea, searching for the small shape of the Maribel between rising crests. Daniel feeling both relief and a new kind of tension, because proximity in heavy weather could destroy as easily as it could save. The seas now stacked in confused patterns under sustained 35-knot winds, cross swells slamming unpredictably, and the drogue line shuddering with each surge as though aware that timing had become everything. The rescue vessel sounded 2 short blasts, then one long, signaling approach from windward. A smart move to reduce drift and maintain control. Daniel adjusting the rudder slightly to keep the bow aligned while Luis prepared the heaving line they would need to secure connection, hands stiff but steady enough. Both men understanding that if their boats collided broadside, the impact could splinter wood or tear metal, and that the final minutes before contact might be the most dangerous of the entire storm. A wave larger than the rest lifted the Maribel sharply, exposing her hull in the glare of the approaching lights, and for a brief suspended second, Daniel saw how small they truly were, compared to the steel vessel closing in. The next trough dropping them hard enough to rattle the cabin windows, the drogue line snapping tight with a crack that sounded too close to breaking, fibers parting one by one under strain. Luis shouting that the backup line was holding but barely. Rain blinding them both as the rescue vessel throttled carefully, engines rumbling deep and controlled. "On the next rise," Daniel shouted, calculating the rhythm again, counting seconds between sets, waiting for the moment when both boats would crest nearly level. Not too close, not too far. And when it came, the The rescue crew threw a weighted line across the gap, the first attempt falling short into the black water, the second landing across the Maribel's bow rail where Luis lunged forward and caught it just before another swell tore it away, fingers burning from the friction as he hauled the heavier tow line across, securing it with deliberate knots that had to hold against both drift and panic. The connection tightened gradually as the larger vessel increased throttle just enough to take tension, aligning both bows into the wind, reducing the violent roll to something controlled, though still punishing. Daniel cutting free the failing drogue at the precise second the tow went taut, the old line whipping away into darkness, and for the first time since the engine had gone silent, the Maribel no longer drifted aimlessly, but moved with intention again. Not under her own power, but guided through the storm's final fury, the horn sounding once more not as warning but as assurance. And in that deep, steady tone, Daniel allowed himself the smallest breath of relief, knowing survival was no longer a question of isolation but of endurance through the last miles of heavy sea. By 7:32 p.m., the tow line had settled into a brutal but steady rhythm, stretching and relaxing with each swell as the larger vessel pulled them northeast towards safer water, its engines maintaining a careful balance between power and restraint, because too much throttle would snap the line, and too little would leave both boats at the mercy of cross seas. Daniel standing at the bow despite the cold, watching the tension angle, reading it like a compass needle, while Luis remained inside the cabin monitoring the bilge and checking for new leaks that might have formed during the worst of the pounding. The air temperature now hovering in the mid-40s, wind chill cutting deeper through soaked clothes, fatigue beginning to creep in where adrenaline had carried them before. The seas did not calm simply because help had arrived. They remained steep and confused, waves striking at irregular intervals that forced the Maribel to yaw slightly behind the tow, the line snapping taut with each misalignment, Daniel signaling with a flashlight when the angle grew too sharp, the rescue vessel responding with subtle throttle adjustments that kept both bows pointed into the wind. A choreography conducted in darkness and rain, every correction measured, because a single mistake could swing them broadside and undo everything gained in the last 15 minutes. Inside the cabin, Luis noticed something new, a thin but steady trickle of water along the port seam near the stern. Not catastrophic but persistent, likely from strain during the earlier side impacts. He called out calmly, no panic in his voice now, only focus, and Daniel crawled back to inspect it, running his fingers along the seam, confirming that the hull held but needed reinforcement. They worked together in tight quarters, applying sealant tape and bracing a spare board against the weak point, hands clumsy from cold yet precise enough to hold, because even under tow, the storm was not finished with them. At 7:50 p.m., lightning flashed closer, illuminating both vessels in stark white relief, revealing the scale of the seas still rolling through the Gulf, 6 to 8 feet now with sharp crests breaking under the wind. And in that sudden brightness, Daniel saw how narrowly they had avoided disaster earlier. The drogue line long gone, their small boat entirely dependent on the steady pull ahead, the horn of the rescue vessel sounding once more, short and reassuring, as if to confirm they were still there, still aligned, still moving forward. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the intervals between the heaviest sets lengthened, the storm cell moving eastward as the front pushed through, winds easing just enough to lower the sharpest crests, rain thinning from sheets to steady fall. And though the Gulf remained restless, it no longer felt chaotic. Daniel sensing the shift first, then Luis, neither speaking it aloud, but both understanding that survival had moved from immediate danger to sustained endurance, the shoreline still unseen, the night still long, but the direction now certain, and for the first time since the engine fell silent, the future extended beyond the next wave. By 8:25 p.m., the worst of the frontal surge had passed eastward, yet the Gulf remained unsettled, long heavy swells still rolling beneath a stubborn southwest wind that hovered near 25 knots, the tow line stretching in a steady diagonal between the steel rescue vessel and the smaller wooden Maribel. Daniel, standing near the bow with one hand braced against the rail, feeling each vibration travel through rope into hull, measuring safety not by sight but by tension, while Luis rotated between the manual bilge pump and the stern seam they had reinforced, checking that the trickle remained only a trickle, because exhaustion now posed a quieter danger than the storm itself. The rescue vessel signaled by radio that they were making slow progress toward shallower water north of their original drift. Daniel answering in short, clear transmissions to conserve the remaining battery power in their handheld unit. Coordinates confirmed. Drift estimated at nearly 12 nautical miles west from the point of engine failure, a fact that settled heavily in his chest because it revealed how quickly distance accumulates when propulsion disappears. The shoreline still invisible in darkness, though radar aboard the larger vessel tracked it patiently ahead. Another uneven set rolled through just before 9, the Maribel yawing slightly as cross-current shifted under the hull, the tow line snapping tight with a jolt strong enough to throw Luis against the cabin wall. No injury, but a sharp reminder that tension never fully leaves until harbor lights appear. Daniel flashing a beam toward the larger vessel to indicate alignment needed correction. The engines ahead adjusting subtly, reducing strain, restoring the angle into the wind. And in that silent cooperation between crews separated by rain and distance, there was something steadier than fear. A shared understanding of physics and timing. Cold had settled deeper now, air temperature edging toward the low 40s as the front cleared. Wet clothing stiffening, fingers slower. Daniel forcing both of them to eat from a small emergency ration kept beneath the console. Not because hunger pressed, but because strength would fade unnoticed otherwise. Luis swallowing mechanically, eyes half closed between tasks. Both men speaking less as concentration replaced adrenaline. The storm no longer roaring but muttering, its power spent yet still present in the rolling dark water around them. At 9:17 p.m., a faint amber glow appeared far ahead through thinning rain, not bright enough to reflect off the clouds yet distinct against the black horizon. Daniel narrowing his eyes until the pattern resolved into fixed lights rather than lightning. Shore infrastructure. Perhaps a platform or harbor approach. The rescue vessel's horn sounding once in confirmation, and though the sea still lifted them with stubborn force, the sight of distant light altered something fundamental inside both men. Survival no longer abstract or deferred, but approaching in measured miles. Each pull of the tow line drawing them incrementally closer to land that had felt impossibly far away only hours before. By 9:46 p.m., the amber lights ahead had separated into a clear pattern, harbor beacons marking the approach channel north of Terrebonne Bay, steady and deliberate against the moving dark of the Gulf. The rescue vessel reducing speed slightly to adjust for shallower depth and submerged debris, carried out by the recent weather. Daniel feeling the change immediately through the tow line as its tension eased from brutal strain to controlled pull. The seas lowering to 4 and 5 feet, though still uneven. Cross swells lingering like aftershocks beneath the hull. And for the first time since the engine failed, the Maribel rode with something close to stability, rather than constant punishment. Fatigue settled heavily now that urgency had loosened its grip. Luis leaning against the cabin frame with eyes half closed between checks, forcing himself upright every few minutes to confirm the stern seam held firm, the reinforced board damp but secure, bilge water steady and manageable. Daniel remaining at the bow despite numb fingers because vigilance could not fade too soon. The entrance to the channel requiring careful alignment, shoals unforgiving in storm aftermath, the rescue vessels signaling by horn and radio before making a slow, controlled turn toward protected water. The tow line adjusting angle once more, but without the violent snap that had defined the open Gulf. As they crossed into the outer edge of the channel, the character of the water changed, not calm but organized. Waves shortening and losing their chaotic cross pattern. Wind dropping below 20 knots as land disrupted its force. Rain thinning to a light steady fall that no longer blurred vision completely. Daniel exhaling slowly without realizing he had been holding tension in his shoulders for hours. Luis stepping outside beside him despite the cold, both men staring ahead at the fixed lights that no longer drifted with the horizon, but held their position steadily against darkness. The rescue crew signaled they would maintain tow until dock, no transfer at sea, too risky with lingering swell. Daniel acknowledging with a raised hand and brief radio reply, conserving words because speech now felt unnecessary, the worst decisions behind them, the remaining task one of patience rather than crisis. And as the shoreline grew from abstract glow into visible structure, piers and cranes and low industrial buildings emerging from shadow, the memory of the silent engine returned not as panic, but as lesson. A small click in a cabin that had opened into hours of endurance. At 10:12 p.m., they passed the final outer marker buoy, its reflective paint flashing in the rescue vessel's lights. The tow line still taut but gentle now, harbor water dark and steady beneath them. And though the storm clouds still moved eastward overhead, the gulf no longer felt endless. The distance that had threatened to swallow them replaced by measurable space between dock lights, Daniel allowing himself one long breath of relief, while Luis stood beside him, silent and exhausted. Both men understanding that survival had not come from luck alone, but from small, precise choices made when fear pressed hardest. At 10:38 p.m., the tow slowed to a crawl as the rescue vessel guided the Maribel alongside a working dock lit by sodium lamps that hummed softly in the damp night air. The wind reduced now to a tired 15 knots, and the harbor water rolling in low-controlled swells against pilings. Daniel stepping carefully onto solid planks for the first time in hours, legs unsteady not from injury, but from the body relearning stillness. Luis following with equal caution, both men silent as dock hands secured additional lines to stabilize the boat before the tow rope was finally eased and released, its long wet curve dropping slack into the dark water like a finished sentence. The engine remained silent when Daniel tried it once more under dock light, the starter giving only a weak mechanical click before surrendering completely. Confirmation that the battery and charging system had failed together somewhere out in open water. A small cascade of electrical weakness that had grown into full isolation. The rescue captain explaining calmly that several vessels had reported sudden weather escalation that afternoon. The frontal boundary strengthening faster than predicted across the northern Gulf. Seas building to 8 feet offshore by early evening. Daniel nodding as he listened. Not surprised now, only aware of how thin the line had been between routine workday and prolonged drift. Luis leaned against the rail and looked back toward the open channel where darkness still moved beyond the harbor lights, the storm's remnants trailing eastward, and neither man spoke for a long moment because words would have reduced the scale of what had happened. The hours measured in knots and volts and degrees of wind direction. The decisions made quietly without argument. Deploying the drogue at the right moment, conserving the flares, waiting for structure before signaling, cutting the failing line only when tension transferred cleanly to steel ahead. Each small action stacking into survival. When the paperwork was complete and the rescue vessel powered away to resume patrol, the harbor seemed almost too calm, ropes creaking gently against cleats, rain fading into mist. Daniel resting his palm against the worn cabin door of the Maribel, as if greeting an old companion rather than a vessel that had nearly become a drifting object in open sea. Luis asking softly whether they would repair her or sell her. Daniel answering after a pause that some things are worth fixing because they teach you exactly where they are weak, and exactly how strong you must be in return. Near midnight, the wind dropped further, and the last heavy clouds moved off the coast, leaving only low gray remnants over the Gulf of Mexico. The storm of that February day continuing east toward other waters. But for two fishermen on a Louisiana dock, the lesson had settled into something steady and practical. That survival is rarely dramatic in a single moment. It is built from small, disciplined choices made while the horizon disappears, and that sometimes the quiet click of an engine failing is not the end of control, only the beginning of deciding who you will be before help arrives. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.